All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Get ready because today we are really digging into a stack of source material you've shared with us. We've got textbooks, some really fascinating historical analysis pieces here.
hmm
And our mission today, well, it's to take a proper deep dive into, honestly, one of the most pivotal moments of the 20th century, Japan's decision to attack Pearl Harbor in December 1941.
That's right. And we're not just looking at the what happened, but really trying to unpack the complex why behind that decision.
Yeah.
We'll look at the immediate, really seismic results of the attack itself.
Yeah.
And crucially, we need to explore how historians, using different evidence and different perspectives, have interpreted these events over time.
Which is so important. If you're grappling with this period, maybe for studies like, say, the IB program, understanding these layers. It's not just facts, it's motivations, consequences, and that whole ongoing historical debate. That's essential, isn't it?
Absolutely essential. It moves beyond just memorization into
Yeah.
actual historical understanding.
Exactly. And your sources, they give us the perfect map, really, to explore just that. So, should we jump in?
Let's do it. So if we're asking why Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, we really have to start with their strategic goals in East Asia. It's clear from the sources, isn't it? Japan had these, well, expansionist aims.
Hmm. They'd already moved into northern Indochina.
Right. And then by July 1941, they struck a deal with Vichy France, the government in France collaborating with Germany at the time,
Okay.
and pushed even further south into southern Indochina.
And that move, that southward push, that really triggered a reaction, didn't it?
Oh, definitely. This wasn't happening in a vacuum. The United States, Britain, China, the Dutch government in exile,
Hmm.
they all saw this expansion as a direct threat.
A threat to their interests, their security in the region.
Exactly. And this led to the formation of what gets called the ABCD bloc.
ABCD, Americans, British, Chinese, Dutch. Okay.
Right. They were aligning pretty clearly against Japan's advances.
Hmm.
And the U.S. response, it wasn't just, diplomatic notes.
No, they took action. July, August 1941. What did they do?
Well, they froze all Japanese assets in the U.S. That's huge. They started sending significant financial aid to China, who Japan was already at war with.
Right.
And then, the really big one, they slapped an embargo on critical resources, specifically oil and scrap iron.
Wow. Okay. And that oil embargo. The sources really emphasize how massive this was. It's described, I think one source says Japan saw it as tantamount to an act of war. That's strong language.
It is,
Huh.
because oil was quite literally the lifeblood of their military and their economy. Japan has very few natural resources of its own, especially oil.
So cutting that off.
It threatened to completely triple them. They needed oil for their navy, their army, their industries, and much of the oil they hoped to control was in the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia. The embargo essentially cut off their access.
So it created this incredible pressure point, as you said.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Which leads us to the dilemma Japan faced, as laid out in the sources.
Right, this fork in the road. What were the options, really?
Well, on one hand, they could submit to the U.S. demands. And those demands were tough.
Like what?
Things like withdrawing completely from China, including Manchuria, which they'd controlled for years,
Hmm.
and also pulling out of Indochina, plus potentially having to ditch alliances like the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy.
That sounds like, well, national humiliation from their perspective, maybe?
Yeah.
Giving up decades of expansion.
Exactly. It felt like submission, leading to, decline. The other option,
Go to war.
go to war, forcibly seize the resources they needed, the oil, the rubber, the tin from Southeast Asia, particularly the Dutch East Indies and Malaya, before their existing stockpiles ran out.
Which they calculated wouldn't last that long, right? Especially the oil.
Precisely. So it felt like a choice between, as one historian put it, submitting to relative decline or taking a huge gamble on war.
And this wasn't a sudden decision, was it? The idea of war with the U.S.
No. Your sources show that this kind of strategic thinking was already happening earlier. Admiral Yamamoto, the head of the Japanese combined fleet, as early as April 1941, he believed that if war did come with the U.S., Japan's only chance, their only hope of victory against the much more powerful U.S. fleet, was through a devastating surprise attack right at the outset.
So the idea of a Pearl Harbor-style attack was already being considered months before.
The strategic logic was there, yes. Knock out the U.S. Pacific Fleet in one blow to
Yeah.
buy Japan time to secure Southeast Asia and fortify its defenses.
Wow. Okay, but meanwhile, on the surface, diplomacy was still happening in late 1941,
It was. You had negotiators like Admiral Nomura and Ambassador Kurusu in Washington, D.C.
working under Prime Minister Konoe first, and then later General Tojo took over as Prime Minister.
Correct. But behind the scenes, back in Tokyo, the sources describe this intense internal debate raging.
Between different factions.
Absolutely, at powerful war factions, especially within the Imperial Army, who increasingly saw war with the U.S. as, well, pretty much inevitable. Necessary, even.
And on the other side.
You had more cautious voices, sort of peace factions, although their influence seemed to shrink as things got more tense. Navy Minister Oikawa, for example, was apparently initially opposed to war, but the momentum was building.
And this led to actual policy decisions, setting timelines.
Yes, the September 1941 guidelines for implementing national policies. These are really key. They basically set deadlines.
Deadlines for what?
For diplomacy to succeed. Initially, the deadline was mid-October. When that passed, the new prime minister, Tojo, extended it, but only to November 30th.
So if negotiations didn't achieve Japan's aims by the end of November?
War would be the chosen path. The clock was seriously ticking.
And what did success look like for Japan in those negotiations? What were they demanding?
Fundamentally, they wanted the U.S. to stop aiding China, stop its military buildup in Southeast Asia, and crucially, lift those crippling economic sanctions, especially the oil embargo.
But the U.S. position was completely different, wasn't it?
Worlds apart, really. Which brings us to that critical moment, the delivery of the whole note, on November 26, 1941.
Named after the U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull. What did this note actually demand?
It laid out the U.S. position very starkly. It demanded Japan's complete withdrawal of all its forces, military, police, everything from China, including Manchuria, and from French Indochina.
Complete withdrawal. That's huge.
It also called for both sides to give up extraterritorial rights in China, basically. The right for their citizens to be tried under their own laws, not Chinese laws. And it insisted Japan recognize only Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government as the legitimate government of China.
Okay. And Japan's reaction to this whole note, how did they take it?
Your sources make it clear. They saw it as an ultimatum. Some even described it internally as effectively a declaration of war from the U.S. side.
An ultimatum because the demands were just seen as completely impossible to meet.
Precisely. This is where we see some fascinating historical debate emerge, even in how different figures reacted at the time. Your sources mention historians Dewis and Hatha discussing this.
What did they say?
Well, the Japanese foreign minister, Togo Shigenori, was apparently devastated. He saw the note and felt it slam the door shut on any possibility of peace. But some of the military leadership were reportedly almost elated, relieved even.
Relieved, why?
Because in their view, it removed any ambiguity. It confirmed their belief that war was inevitable and necessary, and now they had, essentially, the justification, the final push, to proceed. The path was clear for the war they wanted.
That's quite a contrast. Despair versus relief.
It really is. And it seems to have solidified the argument of the war hawks. Delaying any longer would only allow the U.S. war machine to get stronger and stronger.
So better to strike now, even if it's a gamble.
Exactly. That's where Niall Ferguson's interpretation comes in the idea of Japan feeling compelled to take a gamble on immediate war rather than submit to relative decline. They felt cornered.
Not necessarily confident about winning a long war, maybe, but seeing the surprise attack as their only chance to avoid what they perceive as inevitable U.S. dominance and subjugation otherwise.
That seems to be the calculation they made, yes. So, with diplomacy seen as having reached a dead end with the whole note, the military option, Yamamoto's surprise attack plan, was greenlit.
Which brings us to the day itself. December 7th, 1941 in Hawaii. December 8th in Asia because of the international dateline.
Japan launches this massive, devastating surprise aerial attack on the main base of the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor.
And the immediate results, the damage. It was horrific, wasn't it?
Absolutely devastating. The sources list the losses. 8 American battleships were hit hard. 4 of them actually sunk or completely capsized.
8 battleships, that's the core of the fleet's power right there.
It was. Plus 3 destroyers, 3 light cruisers, several auxiliary ships were knocked out. And on the airfields, 177 American aircraft destroyed or badly damaged.
And the human cost.
Tragically high. 3,297 Americans killed in the attack. Terrible toll.
But there's that often mentioned point. The U.S. aircraft carriers weren't in court that day, were they?
No, by sheer luck, they were out at sea on maneuvers or delivering planes elsewhere. And that absence would prove absolutely crucial later in the Pacific War, especially at battles like Midway.
Right. And Japan's losses in the attack itself.
Comparatively tiny. Your sources say just 29 aircraft and 55 personnel lost. From a purely tactical, immediate military perspective, it was a stunning success for Japan.
But it's so important to remember, and your sources stress this, Pearl Harbor wasn't just a one-off attack, was it?
Not at all. It was the dramatic opening move of a much, much larger coordinated offensive that Japan launched almost simultaneously or within hours, right across the Pacific and Southeast Asia.
Where else did they strike?
They attacked British Malaya, aiming for Singapore. They attacked Hong Kong. They invaded the Philippines, which was a U.S. territory then. They hit Waiag Island, Guam. It was a massive, sweeping assault aimed at crippling Allied power in the region and seizing those vital resources we talked about.
So a huge strategic gamble playing out across thousands of miles.
Exactly. And the political consequences were immediate and profound. This instantly globalized the conflict.
The U.S. declared war on Japan the very next day, December 8th, 1941. Famously, Roosevelt called December 7th a date which will live in infamy.
Mm-hmm. And Britain and the Dutch government in exile, already under attack themselves in Asia, they also declared war on Japan on December 8th.
And then, just a few days later, Japan's allies in Europe stepped in.
Yes. Germany and Italy declared war on the United States on December 11th. That formally linked the wars in Europe and Asia into one massive global conflict, World War II as we know it.
There's also that point of controversy mentioned in the sources about the timing of Japan's declaration of war, isn't there?
Ah, yes. The message that was supposed to be delivered by Nomura and Kurusu in Washington before the attack began.
But it was delayed.
Massively delayed, apparently due to issues with decoding and typing up the final message at the Japanese embassy. So they actually ended up delivering the note, formally breaking off negotiations well after the bombs had already started falling on Pearl Harbor.
Which obviously looked terrible. It fueled accusations that Japan was being deliberately deceitful, using the ongoing talks as just a smokescreen. Roosevelt was reportedly furious about this perceived duplicity.
He was. He felt it was abominable, as you said. But your sources also bring in a counter perspective for balance.
Okay.
Historian Eri Hata, for instance, argues that the negotiators themselves, Nomura and Kurusu, might not have actually been told about the absolute final deadline, or that the attack fleet had already sailed days before.
So from that view, it might have been more about internal communication breakdown and bureaucracy within the Japanese system, rather than intentional deceit by the diplomats.
That's the argument. It doesn't excuse the surprise attack, of course, but it adds a layer of complexity to that specific point about the delayed notification. It shows how even small details can be interpreted differently.
And that leads us perfectly into the whole idea of historiography, doesn't it? Which is basically the study of how history itself is written, how it's debated, and how different historians interpret the same events.
Exactly. Because complex events like Pearl Harbor and the outbreak of the Pacific War, they don't have one single, simple explanation. Historians look at the evidence, but they ask different questions, focus on different factors, and sometimes reach different conclusions.
Your sources actually list a whole range of reasons historians have put forward for why the war broke out. What are some of those?
Well, there's the argument that it was primarily driven by Japan's long-term goal of achieving economic dominance in East Asia, the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere.
Right. Or maybe a desire to end European colonialism in Asia, though Japan's own actions were imperialistic too, of course.
Mm-hmm. Then there's the undeniable impact of those U.S. trade embargoes, particularly oil. Was that the main trigger?
Or was it Japan's fear that the U.S. military was growing too strong and it was a now-or-never situation to challenge them?
That's another key argument. The influence of events in Europe is also debated. Did Germany's successes make Japan bolder?
And finally, Roosevelt's own policies, particularly the whole note, was that effectively an ultimatum that forced Japan's hand?
All of these are factors historians weigh differently. Your sources give some specific examples of these varying interpretations.
Like Rana Mitter.
Yeah, Mitter emphasizes the centrality of that U.S. demand for Japan to get out of China. He argues Tojo genuinely believed war was inevitable once that demand was made so firmly.
Okay, so focusing on the China issue as the core disagreement. But then you have someone like Ian Buruma.
Right, and Buruma, as presented in your sources, suggests something slightly different. He argues the whole note might have been less the cause and more of a pretext.
A pretext, meaning?
Meaning perhaps the decision, or at least the strong inclination, towards war was already there, driven by military factions and longer-term plans. Remember Yamamoto's thinking back in April? And the whole note just provided the final justification, the trigger they needed or were waiting for.
Interesting. So was the note the final straw or just a convenient excuse? That's a key historiographical debate right there.
It is. And then looking at the American side, Robert Dallek offers insight into Roosevelt's reaction.
What does he suggest?
Dallek argues that while Roosevelt was genuinely distressed by the attack and the loss of life, there might also have been a sense of, well, perhaps relief isn't quite the right word.
As if the decision was made for him.
Something like that. The attack instantly unified American public opinion, which had been deeply divided about getting involved in the war. It ended the debate and rallied the nation behind the war effort in a way that might have been harder otherwise.
Okay, that's a complex psychological interpretation. Then Anthony Best, he broadens the view again, doesn't he?
He does. Best really emphasizes the complexity, bringing Britain's role more into focus, trying to defend its empire, influencing U.S. policy. He argues against simply blaming Japan, suggesting it's more helpful to see it as a conflict between established have powers like the U.S. and Britain trying to maintain the existing order.
And rising have-not powers like Japan wanting to fundamentally change that order and redistribute resources and influence.
Exactly. It reframes it away from simple guilt towards a systemic clash.
That's a really different lens. And Andrew Crozier.
Crozier introduces the idea of mutual misunderstanding and mutual underestimation. He suggests both Japan and the U.S. significantly misread each other's intentions, capabilities, and resolve.
So mistakes and misjudgments playing a big role.
Potentially huge role.
Okay.
Crozier also stresses the vital link between the war in the Pacific and the war in Europe. You can't really understand one in isolation.
Right. Neil Ferguson, we mentioned him before.
He reinforces that idea of the strategic gamble Japan choosing war, despite the risks, because the alternative, submitting to U.S. economic pressure and accepting a subordinate role, seemed like a slower but equally certain path to decline.
It's fascinating how many different angles there are, and your sources even show this in how the war is named in Japan.
Yes, that's a great example of historiography in action. The names use 15-Year War, China War, Asia-Pacific War, Greater East Asian War, Pacific War. They aren't neutral labels.
What do they signify?
While calling it the 15-Year War, as some Japanese historians like Bandō Hiroshi and Tsurumi Shunsuke do, implies it was one continuous conflict starting with the invasion of Manchuria in 1931. It frames it as a long imperialist war.
Okay.
Whereas Pacific War, that term, often preferred in the U.S. and promoted by the post-war occupation authorities, tends to focus attention more narrowly on the period after Pearl Harbor, centering the U.S.-Japan conflict. It reflects a different starting point and perspective. Greater East Asian War was the term Japan used during the war itself, reflecting its own ideological framing.
So the very names we use reflect historical interpretations and political viewpoints.
Absolutely. And this connects to broader national narratives about historical responsibility and apology.
Right. The sources contrast that 2015 speech by Japanese Prime Minister Abe Shinzo,
where he expressed deepest remorse, but also suggested future generations shouldn't be predestined to apologize.
with the response from South Korea's then President Park Geun-hye, who emphasized that history cannot be hidden and lives on through testimony.
These are very different ways nations engage with difficult pasts, and these approaches inevitably shape how history is written, taught, and understood within those societies and internationally.
And for you, the listener, especially if you're studying this history, understanding the existence of these different interpretations, the debates, the influence of national perspectives, it's just fundamental, isn't it?
It really is. It shows that history isn't a static collection of facts handed down from on high. It's a dynamic field, an ongoing conversation based on analyzing evidence, asking critical questions, and understanding different viewpoints. It's a core of historical thinking.
So let's just quickly recap what we've covered in this deep dive. Japan's decision to attack Pearl Harbor. Well, it was driven by this really complex mix, wasn't it? Expansionist goals, a desperate need for resources like oil, and feeling cornered by that U.S. embargo.
An embargo they saw as an existential threat. The attack itself was a devastating surprise, a tactical success initially, but crucially it was part of a much larger offensive across Asia and the Pacific.
An offensive that immediately triggered declarations of war, turning separate regional conflicts into a truly global war.
And critically, how we understand all of this today is shaped by historiography, by the diverse ways historians interpret the evidence, debating the weight of different factors, from economics and strategy to diplomacy, ideology, and miscalculation.
Hopefully this deep dive, using your sources as our guide, has given you a kind of shortcut to grasping that complexity, getting beyond just the event to the pressures, the decisions, and crucially, the different ways of seeing it all.
Absolutely.
Which leaves us with a pretty significant thought to chew on, something that really emerges from looking at all these sources and interpretations together. Given everything we've talked about, the economic pressures, the ambitions, the internal debates in Japan, the whole note standoff, the different views on whether war was inevitable, Was this conflict in the Pacific in 1941 really unavoidable? Or were there moments, maybe decisions, that could have been made differently, perhaps by Japan, perhaps by the US or Britain, that might have altered the course of events? And maybe even more fundamentally, what does the fact that there are so many different historical interpretations, often well supported by evidence, tell us about the nature of studying history itself?
Really provocative questions. Definitely something to keep thinking about as you continue exploring the past.
Absolutely. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.